This week we're going to skip ahead in the textbook to chapter 7, and we're going to talk about different costs and how we can predict them. And then we'll also talk about flexible budgets and create our own small flexible budget by the end of the week. Our learning objectives this week are to distinguish between different types of costs, analyze cost behavior patterns, apply the cost volume formula, and as I mentioned, we'll create a flexible budget that we can use to compare to actual results. A company as a whole typically has several different cost pools or several different cost departments. Sales and marketing is one. It's where sales commissions are, advertising, other marketing efforts. General and admin, and this is where all of your corporate accounting might be, your CEOs, VPs, all the different supplies they may use would be in this category. If they are a manufacturing company, their manufacturing costs would be in here, so all the costs to make their products. And then they may also have a research and development department as well. So these cost behaviors that we are going to talk about, some of them cross all of these departments. Your textbook does not go into manufacturing costs in great depth in this chapter. I'm going to actually touch on it a little bit more than your textbook does. We will, however, be getting into all these different costs in the coming chapters. So under manufacturing, we have three main types of costs. We have direct labor, we have direct materials, and we have factory or manufacturing overhead. Direct labor are the wages of the employees actually working hands-on to create the product. So they're the ones that are actually, if they're making a piece of furniture, they're the ones that are actually putting the piece of furniture together, maybe putting the upholstery on it, staining or painting it. People that are actually working hands-on to create the product. They're basically touching it to create it. What it doesn't include are people that aren't working hands-on to create it. So it doesn't include your supervisors, your foremen. It wouldn't include anyone that's doing maintenance on the equipment. And it also would not include any shipping or receiving employees. Again, direct labor is when people are working to create the product. By the time you're in shipping and receiving, it's already been created. So shipping and receiving employees would not fall under direct labor. They'd actually fall under factory overhead. Direct materials are the materials that wind up actually being part of the finished product. So using my example of making a chair, if you make it out of wood, the wood's going to be part of it. If it's upholstered, the cushion, the fabric, the tacks, all of those things will become part of it. Typically, what isn't considered direct materials, though, are those materials that are really hard to measure, or maybe just a very small amount of it's used in the production of a product. So that would be things like thread or glue or solder. When you're soldering something together, it's really hard to measure how many drops of glue you may use in each product. Even if you could measure it, it's really inefficient to measure that small amount of glue with that small amount of cost attached to it. So typically we don't include direct materials, miscellaneous items like glue, thread, solder. Again, items that are small, not a large value of the cost, and that would be difficult to track for each item made. So if it's a cost that's associated with the manufacturing department and it is not direct materials or direct labor, then it's going to fall into factory or manufacturing overhead. So this is where your wages of your supervisors, your foremen, your maintenance, your janitorial staff that's possibly cleaning the building at night, shipping and receiving. These are all costs that'll fall under your factory and manufacturing overhead. This is also where factory supplies would fall in. So factory supplies, maybe to clean the equipment, that would fall into overhead. Brooms, sweeping, 409 or whatever you might be using to clean the equipment with, that's all going to fall into overhead as well. And so will those miscellaneous materials that I talked about in the last slide, such as thread or glue or solder, that are too difficult to track per each item produced. Those actually get put into factory or manufacturing overhead as well. And in that total again are, like I said, any costs that aren't direct materials or direct labor fall into this category. So this would be things like utilities, your electric bill, benefits paid to your employees, payroll taxes, the rental on the building, depreciation on the building. So all the other costs of the manufacturing department that don't fall into direct labor or direct materials. So we have been talking more about departmental costs in the last several slides, and now we're focusing actually more on cost behaviors. So you can have these type of costs within each of the departments we just discussed. So manufacturing, sales, R&D, general and admin, they may all have these different types of costs. So the three types of costs are variable. Those costs that change based on the volume of units we produce or the number of services we provide. Fixed costs are those that do not change with volume produced or services provided. So fixed costs stay the same regardless of how many units we're producing or how many services we're providing. And then mixed or semi-variable costs include both a variable component and a fixed component. So the type of costs that are variable costs are direct materials. As you can imagine, materials that go directly into the product vary with the amount of product that's produced, right? You don't need as much wood if you're not producing very many chairs. Direct labor, same thing. These are the employees that work hands-on the product. So as you produce more product, you're going to need more employees working on it, so the labor is going to go up. Variable factory overhead. There's a component of factory overhead that is variable, that changes as volume increases. Examples of these are factory supplies and our miscellaneous materials, our glue or our thread. As we produce more products, we're going to be using more glue or thread. We may be also using more supplies like cleaner to clean the equipment more often as we produce more items. Also, the hourly wages of our indirect employees. So these are hourly wages of our supervisors, our shipping and receiving employees, our employees doing our maintenance, our employees doing our cleaning. Although they aren't direct labor, as we produce more product, we're going to also need more people coming in to doing the shipping and receiving, more people coming in to clean the equipment. So those wages are variable. Overtime premium. That's also going to be a variable overhead. And an example outside of manufacturing, because remember that variable costs don't just fall in manufacturing, they can fall in sales, they can fall in marketing, they can fall in general administrative. An example of a variable cost in the sales department would be sales commissions. So commissions are paid based on number of units sold, so as we sell more units, our sales commission will increase. Fixed cost examples include fixed factory overhead. So factory overhead has a variable component for some of the costs, and then other costs under factory overhead are fixed, meaning they don't increase with the volume that we produce. So that would be our lease on our building. As I mentioned earlier, if you pay $1,000 for a building, you're going to pay that $1,000 every month regardless of how many units you produce, regardless of how many chairs you sell, or regardless of how many pizzas you deliver. You're still going to pay that same fixed amount for your rent on the building. Depreciation is fixed, so depreciation equipment is going to be the same. Typically, there are some methods that do vary with volume, but most methods are going to be fixed. Benefits are typically fixed, regardless of the number of hours or overtime people work. Typically, their benefits are the same. Salaries of indirect employees are fixed. So here we're talking about salaries, not wages. So if your supervisor is paid a salary instead of a wage based on number of hours worked, that's going to be fixed. So if they earn $3,000 a month and that's their salary, that's not going to change with volume. However, if they're paid by the hour and they work more or less hours depending on how many units are produced, that's going to actually be a variable cost. And then your insurance for the building, that typically also is a fixed cost. You're going to pay a certain amount of insurance no matter how many units you produce in a month. Most of your general and administrative expenses are also fixed. So that would be your salaries of your accounting department, perhaps your HR department, the supplies and other costs that they have. Those are typically fixed and they don't vary with volume as much. And then your salespeople's salaries are a fixed cost. So commission is based on perhaps the volume of units that salesperson sold. However, their base salary is a fixed amount every month, so that would actually be a fixed cost. And then you have your mixed or semi-variable costs. So these are costs that contain both a fixed component and a variable component. If you look back at the past two slides where we talked about factory overhead, we had some pieces of factory overhead that were fixed and some that were variable. So if you wanted to consider your factory overhead as a whole, it's actually a mixed cost because there's some semi-variable costs in there and some fixed costs. Maintenance and repairs can be a mixed cost. There might be a set base amount of maintenance that you have to do every month, and then there's a certain amount that varies based on the volume. Equipment rental, if you think about copiers, quite often there's a base amount of maybe $300 a month to lease it, and then you may pay 2 cents per copy used. Utilities can sometimes be a mixed cost. Again, some of these mixed or semi-variable costs, it really kind of depends on how they're charged out, whether or not they're mixed or 100% variable. It really kind of depends on how they're charged out. But utilities, if you use a base amount of electricity, no matter how many units you produce, if you have to keep the lights on, that can be a mixed cost. Some utilities are also billed out with a base dollar amount. Like your base bill is going to be $100 no matter how much electricity you use. That can be a mixed cost. Utilities can also be completely a variable cost. If you can go from completely shutting the lights off to producing like crazy, then utilities may be totally a variable cost. It really kind of depends on each company looking at their expenses in detail to see how they're utilized. And vehicle usage can also be a mixed cost. There may be a certain component of it's fixed that you wind up paying the same amount every month. If you've got a lease payment on a vehicle, that may be the same every month. And then if you look at gasoline charges or maintenance and repair, that can be a variable component of your vehicle costs. So mixed and fixed and semi-variable, all those different costs, you really want to look at the cost in detail to figure out, hey, is this all fixed? Is this all variable, or is this mixed? So again, it really depends on the type of cost and how the company pays it. One of the most important things we want to talk about as we're starting to look at cost behaviors and how we can predict them is the relevant range. And this is the range over which we actually can make an accurate prediction. This is the level of volume, the level of units that we're producing over which we can rely on our cost to stay fixed or to stay variable. For example, if we normally make 100 chairs a month and all of a sudden we make 1,000 chairs a month, we may be making so many more chairs, we may have such a higher volume that we may need to lease an entire new facility. In that case, if we're making 2 lease payments on 2 buildings, we don't have fixed costs anymore that are the same. We've now gone to actually increasing our fixed cost because we've gone outside of the relevant range. Using the same example, if we were making 1,000 chairs a month and all of a sudden it looks like we're only going to be making 200 chairs a month, that could mean that we're closing a building. So now again, our fixed costs aren't the same because we've actually had to close the facility because our volume was so low. So relevant range is very important because that is the range over which our fixed costs are always the same and our variable costs increase. So all companies have a particular range over which they can produce without having to incur additional fixed costs. And these are some graphs of cost behaviors. You're not going to need to do a graph for any of your homework assignments. This is just to look at the different costs visually. If you look at this one, your axis here is for your dollar amount, your cost amount, and your axis here is for your volume. So for the fixed cost, you can see as your volume increases, your cost doesn't increase. It stays the same no matter how many units you produce. If you look at variable costs, this is your volume across here. These are your costs. And you can see that for every single unit you produce, your costs are steadily climbing. So your cost is going up based on the number of units you produce. This last one here, if you look in your textbook, it tends to show this graph more as a mixed or variable cost. And this is actually a true graph of a mixed or semi-variable cost. So if you look at this, a mixed or semi-variable cost has a component of the fixed cost in it and a variable cost component. So right here is where the fixed cost comes in. You get up to this point, you've got your fixed costs where it would not increase with volume. And then from here on out, your variable costs are kicking in. So this is the component that's fixed, and this is the component that's variable. This last graph here is more what your textbook is showing as a semi-variable cost. And while this does model a semi-variable cost, it's more of a particular type of semi-variable cost rather than the traditional graph that most of us think of. What this is showing is that you do have a component that's fixed right here. And instead of your variable cost increasing steadily, there's a certain point in volume at which your variable cost all of a sudden shoots up. So this is what your textbook is showing. It is more of what it's called is more of a step graph, and it's not a traditional semi-variable graph. So that's the difference between what's shown in your textbook and what's shown on the slide.